If you guys are looking in the vicinity of your screen right now, you will see that I'm going to be ranking every single Tony Ferguson loss ranked from saddest to the least sad. The top tier is we're putting the dog down. I think this is a pretty uh, good term to define some of these losses. This is basically around the point where we're all like, Tony Ferguson should potentially retire or his career is never going to be the same again. Next up, we have ugly crying. These are the ones that, pierce your heart. It really makes you think, like, feel a certain way, let's just say. But I mean, it's not the end of the world. You know, Tony Ferguson will have a career afterwards, or the train hasn't been derailed too significantly yet. Shower thoughts is just sad when your favorite fighter loses over and over again. That's just what the tier represents. Just a sadness that you feel after someone loses. Oh man, it doesn't really matter, but it sucks that they lost. And the neutral, it is what it is. Life goes on. I'll start us off with Tony Ferguson versus Michael Johnson. I'm going to put that in the neutral tier. Comparatively to everything else that's going to be appearing on this list soon, I think this is the one that is the most understandable. Tony Ferguson was on a 3-fight win streak, and this was the sole loss that derailed that. He went on a 12-fight win streak afterwards, the legendary 12-fight win streak. This didn't derail him too badly. I mean, he had to win a lot of fights afterwards. Maybe he could have got to a title shot sooner. But in the grand scheme of things, he got dropped once. I mean, it wasn't the worst. Tony Ferguson also didn't have that many fans at this point in the game. So it wasn't like, it wasn't like the masses were upset or crying. Alright, that's probably the least relevant of his wins, because every win after every loss, after this comes basically one after the other. Actually, no, it does. Next up, we have Gaethji versus Tony Ferguson. I was contemplating putting this all the way up in the top tier just because of how much the Khabib fight meant, and we knew afterwards that he couldn't possibly get that shot again, especially since Khabib retired in his very next fight. But I am going to go with the second top tier, just because after this loss, it kind of felt like Tony Ferguson might have been off just because of the weight cut. Like, keep in mind, all these losses are being judged from in the moment how they felt. And this loss right here, I feel like at the time, we were all thinking, yeah, 2 weight cuts in 1 month is tough. The actual fight was pretty brutal, but the light hadn't completely dwindled yet. There was still a chance that Tony Ferguson could get the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight. The only reason it didn't go down is because Khabib's father died, and at the moment, we didn't know that would actually lead to Khabib retiring. I feel like the Khabib retirement is a big reason. Like, in the moment, if we knew Khabib would not fight again after the Gaethji fight, this would probably be the top tier just because of how sad it is that we never got to see that fight. But as a Tony Ferguson loss, I know one of my friends, we were watching it on Discord, immediately left the chat and didn't even come back after the 4th round. So it was pretty sad, but I think there are some losses here that would probably supersede this one. Next up, we have Charles Oliveira versus Tony Ferguson. This was sad. This was the moment I think everyone just came to the conclusion that Charles Oliveira probably is legit, and the fact that Tony Ferguson is probably too old now. I'm gonna... See, this is tough. It's either going in this tier or just behind this one in the second from top tier. It's either shower thoughts or ugly crying. I thought it was kind of funny, Tony Ferguson lost. I'm gonna put in the shower thought, just because they looked so similar before the fight. And then right afterwards, just because my friend was such a big Tony Ferguson fan at the time, I just thought it was just funny that Tony Ferguson was on a slide. But in hindsight, I mean, was I that sad in the moment? I don't think I was. I mean, I was sad, but, But at this point, the Khabib fight, I feel like, had completely flown away. But Khabib had also retired, so we kind of just accepted that. Otherwise, it could be higher. I'm going to put it there for now. Next up, just because the quality, the quality of the losses is just so high in terms of sadness. If we put this up here, it feels like the bar is too low. Anyway, next up we have Beneil Dariush versus Tony Ferguson. I think this was sadder than the Charles Oliveira fight. And I think the reason is just because Beneil Dariush in the moment just wasn't seen as that next level top dog. He was seen as like the guy that's on the come up, but he's like, you know, like the guy that's like just outside the top 10 consistently enough to where they're relevant, but just not a high level name. That's the position that Dariush found himself in, I feel like. But then coming into this fight, I thought Tony was going to lose. I thought he was done. I thought he was cooked. And the actual performance, it was just so sad. Like, if Beneil Dariush can take you down and just dominate you and put you in leg locks and completely, like, put you under threat of submission, Khabib would have absolutely destroyed Tony Ferguson. And it kind of sucks, because prime Tony Ferguson probably beats Dariush, I feel like. He's just quicker, just more explosive. The wrestling's better. But this, I mean, watching it live, it was terrible, because the crowd was just so into Tony Ferguson beforehand as well. I had money on Dariush, but I was still cheering for Tony Ferguson, which kind of just tells you that by the end, I mean, I won money, but in terms of general consensus, I feel like this was probably the point where the retirement talks really, really ramped up. I thought after this fight, Tony Ferguson should possibly retire, but by now I wasn't begging for it. You know what I mean? Like, some of these later losses, I mean, let's use that as a segue to get into the fight against Michael Chandler that Tony Ferguson had. This is the worst one so far. I'm not sure if it'll be the saddest by the end, but it might. The thing with the Chandler losses, we all thought he was done. He took a year off between the Dariush fight and the Chandler fight, and we thought this was going to be one of the most brutal knockouts we've ever seen. Now, it did end up being that, but what happened before, in the first round, Tony Ferguson turned back the clock 5 years younger, it seemed like. He caught Chandler, drops him, and then Chandler just blasts a double leg, takes Tony down, and we're like, okay, we've seen this before. Oliveira dominated him. Dariush dominated him. But all of a sudden, Tony Ferguson was just slicing Michael Chandler from the bottom position in full guard, just slicing Michael Chandler's head. It felt like Tony Ferguson of old was back. He was looking good. We weren't confident, but we were in high spirits going to the second round, sorry. And then that round starts. And just so soon into the round, out of nowhere, Michael Chandler just explodes with an up kick and just completely flattens Tony Ferguson and takes away his chin at that. I feel like he took away his chin. I don't think Tony Ferguson was ever the same after that. There was definitely some sort of brain damage occurring, in my opinion. Some sort of fast track of CTE. Because he looked slower after that fight. Like, he came back a few months later against Nate Diaz, and he was just slower, like old looking. He changed his hair color in this fight, it feels like. Like, he turned him blonde with that up kick. He knocked the black out of his hair, added CTE, and subtracted life. You know what I mean? Like, the years that he has in his life. This is the hope that he gave you in the first round puts in the top of the tier, because it was just so brutal. And then the meme, like, the worst thing that can happen to your favorite fighter is when they get turned into a meme. You know what I mean? Like, the meme and the face, the way his face just mushed all together. It's just. And then Conor McGregor came out calling him Chicken McNuggets, or turned him into a nugget. You know what I mean? Tony used to call McGregor McNuggets. And then that just gets flipped on him, and it's just. At this point, I thought he should retire. Like, this was the point where I was like, Tony Ferguson, you are done. You've done what you're supposed to do in the sport, and now it's time to move on. And then they announced just a few months later that he's going to be fighting Li Jingliang at 170 pounds. A blessing in disguise happens literally a day before the fight, where Khamzat Chimaev misses weight and saves Tony Ferguson from another brutal knockout. He gets rescheduled against Nate Diaz in a Legends matchup. That was probably 5 years too late in the making. Because I remember showing. Sorry, I'm gonna put this at the top tier, by the way. That's where it's going. I remember one of my friends seeing clips of Tony Ferguson, who was not even an MMA fan, and he saw clips and he was like, oh, I'm excited for this pay-per-view because, you know, the Nate Diaz, Khamzat Chimaev hype train. It was a huge event built up for Khamzat Chimaev to get a layup, a free win basically against Nate Diaz. And then this last minute reschedule puts Tony Ferguson on a 4-fight losing streak in the main event position, in the biggest spotlight. And the loss wasn't the worst, but the fight was just, like, you could tell at the, like, this fight, he was so slow. Just so slow, just so terrible. They had no power in their strikes, neither of them. They were both pillow-fisted. And just watching this fight, it was like they were fighting in slow motion. It was just like a huge facade of an event, like a facade of an event, honestly, at this point. Because the fight was just such low caliber. Some of the guys in the prelims aren't that bad usually on these pay-per-views, but the prelims were just completely out. The prelims outclassed them by such a high level, it feels like. And there was just, I mean, I can see the excuse for Nate Diaz because he came out and said he was planning on wrestling the entire time, and that's what he trained for specifically. And that really puts Tony Ferguson in a bad position, considering if you can't beat Nate Diaz, who is specifically training to wrestle, like, who can you beat? Like, you were training to strike, let's be honest here. You're gonna fight Leech. You don't utilize your wrestling to that, like, level anyway, and Leech is just way bigger than you. You're clearly gonna strike with Li Jingliang. And it was just so sad watching him be an old man. Like, this is the fight, by the way, where he does his fight announcement, like, ritual, where he just slides his knee across back and forth in the cage on his side of the corner. And he looked slow. He tripped over his own feet. He was just a dangled mess. And then the way he lost, I mean, it's not the worst, but he went for a takedown. Ironically, and Nate Diaz was clearly training for takedowns, immediately snatches him up with a guillotine. And he taps out before it was even synced in. I mean, cool moment for Nate Diaz. Because he got the 209, like, it was like 2 minutes and 9 seconds or something like that. He got his area code little thing. Badass moment from Nate Diaz, but... And I remember, this is the problem with Tony Ferguson losses. When he loses, the fight was so shit. And then that he kind of was competitive with Nate Diaz in this fight. So people were like, you know what? Let's give Tony Ferguson one more. But by now, I had convinced myself that Tony Ferguson needs to retire. And I thought if he loses to Leech, like, moving up to 170 is like his last resort. But then for some reason, he came back, as we're about to move on and see. I'm going to put Tony Ferguson versus Bobby Green in the shower thoughts tier. Now, this was definitely the fight he should have retired, but it's just that classic Tony Ferguson losing method where look good enough to be like being in a competitive beatdown is different to being in a competitive fight. Tony Ferguson does enough to be in a competitive beatdown where it's just not a complete and utter, like, mismatch. But it was really, like, Bobby Green on the feet was destroying Tony Ferguson. And the theme with each loss of Tony Ferguson is there's something different each time. Against Gaethji, he loses for the first time in like 12 fights. And he gets TKO'd, but not knocked down or anything like that. In the Charles Oliveira fight, he doesn't get submitted, but he gets brutally dominated on the ground. So now we're like, okay, how good is his jiu-jitsu really? The Dariush fight, the same thing happens. The Chandler fight, he finally gets put out completely cold, face first onto the canvas. In the Nate Diaz fight, keep in mind, the Dariush and the Oliveira fight, he doesn't get submitted. But then the Nate Diaz fight, he gets submitted. Like, he actually taps out. Next up, we have the Bobby Green fight, where he gets beaten on the feet, and he tries to hold on and just make it to the bell, you know, like, oh, I still made it to the decision. But I'm so happy that he completely, I mean, in hindsight, I'm happy because, like, it just shows that, like, just being a popular person doesn't mean you're a good fighter. Like, Tony Ferguson has a lot of fans. And Bobby Green has him in the head and arm triangle, I believe. And just and then he's trying to make it to the end of the third round, but then He can't. He passes out. The ref stops the fight. That's a new thing that Tony Ferguson has now. He goes to sleep, doesn't tap out. How tough is he? And then they give him another fight. And I was so sure that this was the fight that Tony Ferguson would retire in. The Paddy Pimlet fight. It's going in the middle tier because by now, every loss is just so sad that we're just so numb to it. We're just waiting for the Tony Ferguson retirement. We're almost going to be happy if Tony Ferguson loses at this point because it just means one step closer to retirement for him. We don't want to see this anymore. Another terrible performance from Tony Ferguson. This one might actually be above Bobby Green, actually. Just because he had David Goggins in his corner. Actually, it was kind of funny that David Goggins was there, just proving that just because you're mentally tough doesn't mean you're good at everything. Like, David Goggins, you're a good runner. You don't know anything about fighting. Why are you training Tony Ferguson? Tony Ferguson should be like putting in the reps, you know, like defending takedowns, throwing submissions off his back, but instead he's on a treadmill running for like 40 kilometers at a time. Why? It was just a stupid decision made by Tony Ferguson, who's also been changing camps, changing training partners throughout this entire ordeal. And then Paddy Pimlet completely dominates him. By now, even Dana White comes out and he says, I would like to see Tony Ferguson retire. I don't know why they offered him another fight after this one. Just pull the plug, Dana. Just pull the plug on Tony Ferguson's career. No one wants to see this. It's just so sad to watch. Every single fight, it feels like. Every single fight is the saddest thing you've ever seen in your life. If you're at all know MMA, a Tony Ferguson fight is like an event of its own. It's like, how sad will this fight be? I hope Tony Ferguson doesn't get finished brutally. Anyway, the David Goggins being there made it funny enough to not being a higher tier, in my opinion, or above Charles Oliveira. The last fight on this list is Michael Chiesa completely ragdolling Tony Ferguson like a child, takes his back in the first round, immediately taps him out. Tony doesn't, I mean, he tries, I guess, but then taps out immediately. Michael Chiesa is one of those fighters that was around when Tony Ferguson was like the boogeyman of the lightweight division. And I feel like a prime Tony Ferguson probably would have beaten that version of Michael Chiesa. But he's just so old. He's just so disheveled. He's like a dried out chicken wing at this point. You know what I mean? He's like a chicken wing Ferguson at this point, dried out. I don't know where to put this because like it's got to be a top 3 tier. I just wasn't that sad. I mean, I was happy that Tony Ferguson's going to finally retire, and that's what he's done now. What he's done is he could have left the sport with fanfare and just as a legend, you know, like a legend that just couldn't hang anymore. He leaves right before he starts losing to guys outside the top 10. So you're like, you know, Tony Ferguson, if he wanted to, he could probably still beat some of these other guys, but, you know, just the top of the division, he just doesn't have it in him anymore. He's leaving out of his own choice because he knows he can still beat, like, the lower ranked guys. He's just the top of the guys that he can't beat, so he knows he can't get the title. So he's going to call it a day. And that's what makes it the most sad about all of it. Like, his legacy is completely in the water. A lot of UFC fans became fans around the COVID time. And all they know from Tony Ferguson is losing. They know nothing but losing. Like, I remember the 12-fight win streak, but the newer fans, all they remember is the losses. I guess that kind of puts this one higher than Paddy Pimlet, in my opinion. But then Tony Ferguson ruined it. He took off one glove, threw it in the cage, said he might or might not retire, and then afterwards basically said he's not retiring. So, you know, I think Dana White just needs to pull the plug on Tony Ferguson's career, just put him out of his misery, let him fight at bare knuckle, let him get knocked out by Mike Perry. I think that's probably the direction he's gonna go in. He's just taken so much CTE damage at this point. Like, everyone's seen the call his wife made to the cops. Him telling his wife that she's a witch. Her waking up to him. Just standing over her, throwing water at her. I mean, it's just so sad. Some of these, I feel like not just UFC, but the Mixed Martial Arts Commission they need to have a policy where they are allowed to unsanction a fighter from ever fighting again, at least in the United States. Because Tony Ferguson, I mean, the damage is going to be lifelong, clearly. Even before the losing streak, he was clearly going to have CTE. He was a bit of a goofy dude. But since I'm just so worried for Tony Ferguson, like, he might end up like Muhammad Ali, like where he just like got Parkinson's, just completely crippled from the brain, you know, like just a vegetable, you know? It's just the saddest thing to see Tony Ferguson end up into this. And I feel like the UFC, I mean, I'm going to end the video soon, but I'm just going to say one last thing. The UFC is a real evil corporation for this stuff here. Consistently not giving Tony Ferguson winnable matchups. Like, why give him Leech? Like, that's who you were trying to match him up with. It wasn't like you were doing him a favor, give him a Legends fight against Nate Diaz. You tried to match him up against the Leech. Bobby Green? Like, Bobby Green hits hard. Like, give him, like, Jared Gordon. You know, someone that's, like, not gonna KO Tony Ferguson, and someone that Tony Ferguson can realistically KO himself. Around the time they gave him Bobby Green, where was Jim Miller? Where was old Cowboy Cerrone? That's a fight that he could have realistically won. Keep in mind, this entire list is relative to the sadness of Tony Ferguson's losing streak. Because some of these other fights that are in the middle tier, for some other fighters, could be in the top tier. Because they're just so sad to watch and experience live as they happen. As I have for every single Tony Ferguson loss. I've watched every single fight he's had in his losing streak live. And it's just been brutal, brutal, brutal to watch. Anyway, I'm going to end the video here. Like, share, and subscribe. I'll make more videos like this. Maybe I do ranking every single Tony Ferguson win. Yeah, let me know if that's something you'd like to see. Oh, and definitely subscribe. I'm on 7 subscribers. Let's try to get to 10 by the end of the week. Thank you.